the Arab world has 5% of the world population, but has only 1% of the world water. Water scarcity in the region is very serious and cannot be exaggerated. The World Bank defines water poverty as any level of consumption per year per person of less than 1,000 cubic meters. Out of the 22 countries the World Bank has identified as falling below the poverty line, this water poverty line, 15 of them are in the Arab countries. And this makes water water scarcity a very serious issue. And this issue is likely to become more difficult and more challenging with global warming. I mean, the climate change is generating a situation where temperatures are expected to rise, sea level is expected to rise, and precipitation is going to be more intense and perhaps less available. The other issue, and it's absolutely also complex and contributes to the difficulties, is the fact that much of this water, some people had exaggerated this in my view, about 85% of the water available is shared water. I've seen numbers that go between 40% and 85%, but it's likely to be somewhere in between. But the fact that no country has water, with the exception of Lebanon, that is totally its own, and that it has to share it, like the Euphrates and the Tigris, Syria, Turkey, and Iraq share. The Jordan River is Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Jordan share this water. And what is perhaps less known and less appreciated, that these two basins here, the Euphrates, Tigris, and the Jordan River, are physically separated, but strategically they are interconnected in the sense that when Turkey started to reduce the flow of the Euphrates and Tigris to Syria and Iraq, Syria started to reduce the flow of water in the Yarmouk River that it shares with the Jordanians and Palestinians. So in some sense, the shared water is creating a complexity of sorts where no country is assured of its share independently or in disregard of what the shares of others. The other issue that has come out of this, in my view, is that the area is characterized by asymmetry of power. And the balance of power is so asymmetrical that it has trumped, has complicated the balance of interest. The Palestinians, Jordanians, Syrians need water more than the Israelis. The agriculture represents about 35% of the total income of the Palestinians, about an equal share in Syria. In Israel, it only represents 2% of their GDP. So in some sense, that asymmetry in how important water is to jobs and income and livelihood is also complicating the story. And as long as you have riparians like Turkey, Israel, Egypt, on the three major water basins, it makes the other riparians, upstream or downstream, vulnerable to the exercise of power of those who command more power than the other groups. There is really no agreement to speak about that is part of the international law. The only major international law principle is that if you have riparian countries, no riparian should use water in any way that could be considered injurious, that could produce injury to the rights of other riparians. But that's about it. But the trouble with this laws is that if you don't have the power, if you don't have the resources, if you don't have the stature, if you cannot depend on the mechanisms of dispute settlements, then the powerful is going to take the water and you're going to be stuck with very little water or very poor quality water. one issue that is also important and deserves more serious attention than has been the case hitherto is that the physical scarcity of water is compounded, is made more difficult by economic scarcity. And what I mean by that, there isn't a single country in the region that is pricing water or using demand management. Most of the activities are concentrated and are heavily focused on increasing supply. Very few countries are trying to see that there will be a more rational, a more serious way of conserving this water. I have studied a number of issues relating to this. For example, in Jordan, Israel, Lebanon, others. Most of these countries are water poor in a relative way, but they all export water-intensive agriculture. I mean, if you rank, say in Israel, the water intensity, like take number one to be the product that uses most water per kilogram or ton of output, and rank them all the way down, and then rank these same output in terms of price or value, and the correlation is negative, which means we're giving more water to products that give us very little income or little value. And then if you look at the pattern of trade, we tend to be exporting those commodities that are water intensive. I mean, water poor countries like Israel, Palestine, Jordan, and others are exporting citrus fruits, watermelon, kind of vegetables, and some are producing cotton, which is very heavily water intensive, and they're not getting the value for it. So that calls for a revision, a reevaluation, and trying to see if this situation is reflecting a deeper problem where we are not using rational economic and other valuation mechanisms to guide the policy and to guide the allocation of the scarce resource. There is talk, I mean, in some sense, there is now some attempt to raise the price of water, but they're raising it, for example, in Jordan to the household sector, which represents less than 5%. I mean, you're not going to get much conservation from the household sector. The culprit is where the maximum amount of waste is in agriculture. They're using irrigation, which they flood the fields because they don't pay for it, you know. And in this respect, there are rooms, margins, wide margins, where we could conserve, we could use more rationally the scarce resource. You can't talk about water without talking about food. In the Middle East, particularly, you can't talk about water without energy. There are a number of countries in the region. Actually, 44% of the world desalination capacity is in the Gulf area. And now there is a fear that 50% of the energy of that region is required in order to purify, desalinate water. And in this respect, the connections, the interdependencies between water and energy has become a major issue here. Israel, for example, has now a capacity to produce 650 million cubic meters of water through desalination. And desalination is energy intensive, but now they're talking about using solar and wind energy. But the story is now, Israel is now saying, oh, we have so much more than we really need. We can sell water to the Palestinians. But by God, if the issue I talked to you about, recognizing property rights of people, we're getting into the preposterous situation where Israel is selling Palestinians their own water. And there is here an issue. I mean, the poor Palestinian economy is being chiseled out of its own water. It doesn't control the aquifer, particularly the eastern aquifer. And Israel seems to be taking and commanding quite a bit of this water by preventing the Palestinians from digging wells, and then taking the water and then saying, okay, now we have surplus water, we can sell you. Well, I mean, don't sell the Palestinians their own water. Give them their rightful share, and that would be much better position here for people to work in a peaceful, collaborative way. Syria now is in the throes of a brutal civil war. Iraq is also in conflict, and ISIS or ISIL or Daesh, whatever, is controlling a large swath of water and sitting on some of the major dams. In this respect, Syria and Iraq are weak. In the Euphrates and Tigris basin, Turkey uses 28% of its water needs from this water. Syria uses 40% of its water needs from these two rivers. Iraq depends to 80%. And this ratio, where the heavy dependence on these two sources of water is extremely high in Iraq and Syria relative to Turkey, and they have no other alternative, Turkey is now building an Ataturk dam and reducing the amount of water that could be available to the Syrians and to the to the Iraqis. And not only that, it's throwing to them runoff water. After it uses it to irrigate fields, they bring it back and say, oh, we're delivering to you the 500 cubic meter per second that our agreement is all about. But it's not the same quality. It's basically unusable water. So in some sense here, the weakness and the continued wars and the lack of symmetry of power is militating against the Syrians or Iraqis getting the rightful share of the quality of water they had depended upon in the past. I've really seen water in Jordan. At one time, the Israelis were pumping water from the Jordan River, allowing the Palestinians to have it, but it was really very poor quality water. You could smell it, you could look at its color. So I've seen it in my own eyes that the quality of this water wasn't there. I've also seen in Palestine, where you go, you see settlements that have huge Olympic-size pools for people to swim. Next to them are fields of Palestinian farmers dying because they are dry and have very limited access to water. I've also seen the fact that water in many areas is not metered. They tell you, okay, we give you half it's the size of the pipe, half a meter. And then you're not paying on a volumetric basis. So I've seen these farmers really turning the tap on, water is running, despite the fact they don't need it, they don't use it. And it tells you that there is a situation where, despite the scarcity, there's a culture of waste. I mean, what you call it, the Auditor General in Israel said there is a culture of waste in Israel with respect to water, because people now don't really have to pay for it in any particular way. They're abusing it, they're misusing it, they're wasting it. And there is endemic to the area a culture of waste. The person who is entrusted with bringing water to the family are typically women, and they have to walk long distances and carry very heavy stuff in order to meet the needs of their households. So to a great extent, there is an asymmetry here among the genders in terms of the responsibilities and about who delivers the water needs of the household. The other aspect is that most of the people who work in agriculture are women. And if agriculture is constrained, if agriculture is not getting its normal and required share of water, it tends to affect the household poverty, and particularly poor households that are invariably households that are have a head of the household as females. you have to bring women to come to these things. So quite often the males, we were basically supportive, trying to field the questions that were basically administered by females. That's a very like this situation you're not going to find in Lebanon. You're not going to find in Syria. You're probably not going to find in Jordan. You're not going to find in Palestine. You're going to find in Iraq. But it's far more in the Gulf and other areas, and in some of the conservative sheikdoms or governments in the Gulf. But in the region where I worked mostly, it was not as much pressing an issue. But when we went to some areas in Egypt, in the Sa'id, in the rural area, and when we come to talk about these issues in the Gulf, we felt that that separation between male female is a little bit more stringent. What is really needed here is that a realization that this water is going to be a major issue. I mean, there is no question about it. The Nile Basin now with Ethiopia is building this Renaissance dam is going to affect the share of Egypt. And the Israeli overexploitation and the water diversion projects in 1964 has affected the people on the Jordan Basin. And the Turkish exercise of hegemonic power is limiting the supplies. We need another framework, an institutional arrangement in which maybe Europe, the United States, Russia, every place else has to come to deal with this, because these bases are nascent areas of violence, and the wars are going to probably be about water than anything else.